Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a big approach. So serious.
I am Iron Man. This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for September 11th, 2023, and I am JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, for this podcast review. If you're tuning into this, you are either a lover of foreign cinema and movies that most people haven't heard of, or you're tuning in because you love us. And that makes me happy.
Well, I hope it's both.
I hope it's a little bit of both as well.
Yeah, I hope it's not as much of an or and more of an and.
Yeah, maybe a little bit of an and.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. The movie that we're obviously here to talk about, as you know, based on the title of this episode, we are talking about The Eight Mountains. And, you know, it's this film that I think premiered at Sundance earlier in the year.
Mm-hmm.
And it had a small little release, at least here in the United States. It didn't really get too much discourse. People haven't been talking about it enough. However, I did pay attention to some of the reviews because some of them have claimed that this is one of the best movies of the year. And it's, you know, a lot of them are really giving high marks to this film. And so it's a movie that has been on my radar for quite some time, and not just because of the reviews, but the directors here in particular, and I'm going to butcher this, so please forgive me.
Good luck.
Felix van Groeningen. And I know that's not how it's pronounced. I've heard him pronounce this himself, and I can't do it. I just can't. So I'm sorry.
Our dialects are physically incapable of matching what he actually says.
Yeah. So I do apologize. However, he's done some movies that I think are really interesting. In particular, The Broken Circle Breakdown was one of my favorite foreign films of 2013 when that film came out.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to recall. But I really loved that film quite a bit. He did Beautiful Boy in 2018 as well. And I don't love that film, but I think there are some really interesting things to it.
Okay.
And now here he is alongside Charlotte Vandermeersch. And they are doing this movie called The Eight Mountains, which takes place in Italy.
Yep.
And you wouldn't have guessed that based off of their names. But, you know, they also did Beautiful Boy, and that doesn't necessarily reflect anything either.
Fair.
So, you know, I do love that they're just all over the map, very literally.
They're they're exploring different mountains, if you will.
Exactly. Brendan, I guess before we get into it, so that was my perspective coming into this. Did you have any sort of, do you have any experience with these filmmakers? Did you have any expectations with this film?
Very little, because like you said, it's not really being talked about much. And honestly, it's one that kind of fell by the wayside for me as well. I probably wouldn't have sought this one out. Not that I wouldn't have enjoyed it. I just didn't really know much about it until you suggested it. And I was looking this up. It was apparently the 2022 Cannes Film Festival was where it premiered. And I think it lost the jury prize or no, it didn't lose. It tied the jury prize, I think, to the other foreign language film, EO, which I know you also enjoyed. Yeah, I was a little mixed on that one. But yeah, so the film, it did garner some pretty positive reviews, and apparently it's holding a solid 78% on Metacritic right now, which is, it's an aggregator. It is what it is, but that definitely shows that there is some positive word of mouth, but maybe it's not so overwhelmingly positive that it kind of falls into this almost forgotten landscape, which is something that happens sometimes, and maybe it shouldn't happen. We'll talk about this movie, and we'll talk about maybe why we think people should seek it out.
Absolutely. And this is the case every single year. There are those foreign films that get the notoriety that maybe tip the scales of popularity a little bit. You think of something like Parasite, for example. That's
yeah.
one that everyone seemed to love. The Worst Person in the World, I think, at least within critic and cinephile circles, is one of those movies that, was very heavily loved and talked about. Blue is the Warmest Color is another one of those that, at least in critic and cinephile circles, was, heavily talked about. And, so like there
thankfully,
are those
like
movies.
the Criterion Collection has helped keep those films at least top of mind for those specific audiences, right? Because
Absolutely.
I was even going to say a movie like Celine Sciamma's Petite Maman, very recent, but that one still kind of has its audience because it was distributed in a certain way when it got to Blu-ray and home video.
Well, yeah, and I was gonna say, while some films tip the scale into at least being well known among cinephiles and critics, I don't know if any foreign language film has really become popularized in recent years, aside from Parasite. Like, broadly speaking, that's a movie that I would say people know because it won Best Picture.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time when you're looking at the best foreign films in a year, if you were to walk into the average American home, will they know any of the nominees at the Oscars, for example?
Probably not.
Any foreign film that you consider to be the best of the year?
Probably not. No, that's a good point.
Most of them won't. However, again, in context, when you're talking about like film people, cinephiles, critics, there's still a dividing line, I think, between those that are talked about and in the discourse, such as A Worst Person in the World, A Parasite, and then there are others that are very good that aren't talked about as much. Petite Maman certainly could be one of those as well. And I think The Eight Mountains is very much one of those examples that falls under that criteria. I mean, this might show up on some top 10 lists, but aside from that, this is a movie that really isn't getting too much. It's not getting talked about a lot. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah.
And for reasons we'll get into, maybe that's warranted, maybe it's not. But we'll talk about it.
We
If
will.
you're not familiar with The Eight Mountains, it is this epic journey of friendship and self-discovery set in the breathtaking Italian Alps. The Eight Mountains follows over 4 decades the profound, complex relationship between Pietro and Bruno.
We don't
All
talk
right,
about
Brendan.
Bruno.
I know. We don't talk about him, but we will.
We're going to talk about this Bruno. Yeah.
Exactly. Brendan, what did you think about The Eight Mountains?
Man, Disney's really upping their game with their live action remakes, this time with Luca. I mean,
I thought a lot about Luca and you while watching this.
I think a lot of people are going to think about Luca, not just the Italian backdrop, the fact that it is a tale of male platonic friendship. I think that's definitely going to be a comparison that a lot of people make. So I'm going to try not to make that comparison again because I feel like it might get tired pretty quickly, although it's even more ironic.
There are some talking points that are comparable, though.
One of the big ones being the fact that Pietro himself is played by Luca Marinelli. That's the actor's name who plays Pietro for most of the movie. You did mention that this is a 4-decade spanning companionship. So that means we're going to have a few different actors come in to play these roles at specific ages, although it's really around maybe the 40-minute mark of this 2.5-hour film where we really solidify the two lead actors.
We get into the adult versions of these characters.
Luca Marinelli as Pietro, and I'm trying to find who it is.
Alessandro
Borghi, who plays Bruno here. And they play these two characters for the majority of this runtime. This is a good movie. It's a good movie. I really quite liked it. I don't know if it'll end up being one of my favorite films of the year. I think at times it's nearly 2.5-hour length, and the more methodical approach to its storytelling did leave a few questions for me, I'll simply say. But I mean, this is the kind of movie I inherently respond to. You know me very well, JD, that you wanted to review this movie together, probably because I'm just susceptible to these kinds of movies that depict male platonic friendship. Although admittedly at times, at least in the first third, I wasn't sure if that platonic nature was going to hold for some of this.
I want to talk about that.
Okay.
Eventually, I want to get there because that's again, why I thought about you quite a bit. The film doesn't quite commit to it, but the themes and ideas of Luca, again, funny enough, I do think bleed into this film in a really interesting way that does fizzle out a little bit. It's not quite committed in the way that Luca is, but it's there enough that I find it interesting.
Yeah, we'll talk about it further. I between the two, I think one's a little bit more nuanced than the other as far as that central relationship is concerned. Not to say one's better than the other, but I do think one of these films maybe has a little bit more ambiguity on its mind. But that is to say, I do think the companionship at play is very compelling in this movie. And a lot of it is because of these two actors and how good that they are together. And you definitely sense the distance between them that they're trying to reconcile, and the way that then further plays into how Pietro's father had a play in this as well. I think in many ways, this is actually more of a tale of fatherhood than it is friendship, which is
It's a big part of it. Yeah.
It's a very big part of it. And especially when the official plot really kicks in, the building of this house in the Italian Alps, which is really where the bulk of the drama takes place. I do think this is quite a beautiful movie. I think a lot of the talking points will mostly be around its cinematography. And this is one of those movies that I think does a really good job getting away from a certain trap that movies like this fall into, that simply take place in beautiful locations that automatically make you think they're beautifully shot, which is not always the case. But I do think the way the camera moves here does add to a certain melancholy. It's the way that shots are captured, and not just the fact that the landscapes are gorgeous. It's certainly much more than that. Kind of reminded me a little bit of the Truffle Hunters in some ways.
Yeah.
The static nature of some of these shots and the way that certain framings are done deliberately, so where it chooses to cut off, where it chooses to slowly move across a particular mountaintop. I do think that's all very deliberately done, and done so well. So I do think this is a very good film. It's definitely one that I think, as far as foreign language films are concerned this year, one that people should check out. I'm not sure if it'll end up getting the notoriety as some of these others that we're hearing about, such as Anatomy of a Fall, for instance, which we haven't seen yet, but I feel like that's kind of the foreign language film to beat at this point now. So we may end up seeing movies like The Eight Mountains fall by the wayside. And at this point now, I think it's at least good enough that we should be talking about it.
I completely agree. This is my kind of movie. I think this is something that falls in line with something like Rams from 2016, I believe that film was.
Oh, yeah. That's a quirkier movie, though.
Or War from 2015.
Yeah.
Like, there are these foreign films that I think are truly great that just don't get the notoriety they deserve because they're not in award season.
They're not in the club.
They're not in the club. And The Eight Mountains will not be nominated for an Oscar. But I think this film should be talked about more. It is utterly gorgeous to look at. Some of the most exquisite cinematography you'll see all year. But again, as Brennan is noting, it's not just the landscape shots. It's how the film utilizes those landscapes, how it utilizes the camera. It's not just these gorgeous mountains that the film is capturing. There is so much more to the cinematography beyond that.
Yeah.
And it is stunning. It is really, really great. Again, the most exquisite cinematography so far this year. The performances here by Luca Marinelli and Alessandro Borghi are like catnip for me. They're primarily internalized and quiet, but so potently affecting. I love what they're doing here with their performances. The score by Daniel Norgren, oh my God, incredible. So good. It is remarkably moving, quintessentially complements the film's spiritual undertones, which is its nucleus, as the film's core is centered around Buddhist and ancient Indian concepts as it relates to the 8 mountains and 8 seas of the world. So much of the story here works in this reflective examination of connection to the world and to each other. And it's extremely methodical. It's meditative. It's often concerned with the quiet moments that these characters share. And while that may be plotting for some, I think the film relishes and thrives because of its patience, especially as it gets into its ideas on self discovery and even self destruction. What's so beautiful and heartbreaking about this film is this juxtaposing parallel between Bruno and Pietro, two characters who cross paths and become friends despite time and circumstance, often driving them apart. And what's so captivating here is how they have the same arc, but in reverse. For Bruno,
point.
he is connected to the mountains and is at peace with his identity from an early age. We see this in those early scenes with young Bruno. And it's in that where he has a deep, intimate connection with Giovanni, Pietro's father, who we come to find out loved the mountains as well. However, Pietro is torn between the mountains and the city. He loves Bruno and loves spending the summer with him, but he doesn't feel wholly connected to it in the same way.
Yeah.
And it actually becomes a dividing line between him and his father, ironically. In fact, it gets to the point where that conflict with Pietro and his father, it rises where he tells his father he wants nothing to do with him. And years go by where he never sees him again. But there comes a point, and this is maybe a slight spoiler, but it's early on. It's a 2.5-hour movie as well. This is early. It's early on enough. I feel like it has to be noted in this conversation because we get to a point where we find out that Pietro's father, Giovanni, dies. And in a weird way, it brings Bruno and Pietro back together again. But as the film unfolds, it's Pietro who begins to find healing and peace and connection through his time in the mountains. And it's Bruno whose identity starts to crumble and become murky. And I think the film poetically and so beautifully suggests that life is as much about losing yourself as it is finding yourself. And that we all have different timelines within that journey. And specifically for Bruno and Pietro, I love that the pivot point for both of them comes through a father figure, a literal father for one, a surrogate father for the other, but one that in the end had a deep, profound impact on the both of them. I was so deeply moved by that in this film. It blew me away. The film, again, it may not get the attention that others will get this fall, but it should. It absolutely should.
Are you describing a Terrence Malick film right
Sort
now?
of. It's just as spiritual.
Which is interesting, not even just as spiritual, it's also just as natural, very much using nature to drive that spirituality as well.
Family,
family, fatherhood, that all plays a part in a Malick film, but nothing about this feels like a Malick film. So I feel like the comparisons really just end there as far as what the film is getting at topically, right? But yeah, you make a lot of great points in how these arcs between Pietro and Bruno are sort of swapped in some ways as the film goes on. But at the same time, someone like Pietro, at least, who never really felt connected to the mountains, even despite that connection he finds, especially through his renewed friendship with Bruno, he still kind of carries that nomadic spirit throughout much of the film, but he does so in a more interesting and natural way, spending a lot of time in Nepal, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's where he does a lot of his book writing in the back half of the film. So he still finds this tie to his natural surroundings, and it gets into this interesting symbolism of the 8 mountains itself and whether there was more adventure or more to experience by exploring the 8 mountains themselves or by finding yourself on the tallest peak instead. And that's sort of the differentiator between Bruno and Pietro. One had more of a, like I said, nomadic spirit. He was more about exploration. And because of that, he claims that he went further distance, right? Whereas Bruno sort of plopped himself on that one natural surrounding, the top of that mountain, and more or less just stayed there, right?
Yep.
But that was his version of peace. That's what he needed. And I think there's an interesting debate to be had about what it means to truly feel fulfilled and what you need to experience in order to achieve that, right? It's a very simple message, but I mean, I think it's ultimately felt in this film because of its surrounding attributes that make it pretty compelling.
Yeah, I mean, I think the film taps into that spiritualism in these really affecting ways. And I think by taking its time and relying on its patience and precision, it allows for that duality of identity and ambition to really come through. Even if simple, it's nuanced in its emotion.
Oh, yeah.
And
Simple doesn't mean empty. It just means it's a very relatable notion, but the film does explore it in a pretty complicated way.
Absolutely. You know, especially because, I mean, you could certainly look at it pragmatically. I think you could look at it in a much more metaphorical way if you want to look at it through that perspective. But I do love the precision of it in the sense that, yes, as you're talking about, Bruno understood immediately who he wanted to be. He wanted to live the life of his ancestors and never wavered from that, even when it wasn't sustainable anymore. His dream was to take over his aunt and uncle's dairy farm, which he did for a while. But even when that became unattainable for him, he never left the mountain. He just did not want to leave, despite there being reasons for him to leave. There was more than enough opportunity, and you could argue that he should have left, given the responsibility that he had taken on as a person, but he never wanted to leave. He was tethered to that mountain regardless. For him, he felt destined. He felt called to be on that mountain. Whereas Pietro wasn't certain at all about his destiny. He very much wavered. He wrote a little bit. He waited tables. He found some odd jobs.
Yeah.
Eventually, he stopped going to and thinking about the mountains altogether. It took a significant point of his life, again, going back to his father, for him to even consider the mountain once again. Because as I noted earlier, not only was there maybe some distance, a little conflict, mostly distance and circumstance that was separating Pietro and Bruno, there was direct conflict that kept him from his father. And he told him he never wanted to do it again. But we come to find out that during that same time, Bruno and Giovanni were very close.
Yeah,
That
they
he
connected
had
in that way.
adopted Bruno, and that they very much did connect. So when this pivot point comes for the both of them, it is interesting how they do reunite, how for Bruno building this house was closure for him as it relates to Giovanni, and for Pietro brought a little bit of redemption to him. And then as things unfold from there, again, it's interesting how they cross paths, but eventually they do swing by each other. And as I noted in my opening thoughts, they, have these contrasting arcs. And it is interesting how they do parallel, despite them eventually going in different directions. And I think, the film wants us to consider that despite how profoundly wondrous the world is in its beauty and in its natural elegance, it is our connection to each other that makes us feel whole and fulfilled. And the ending of the film, it visually depicts that in a very direct and bleak way, but I think there's a lot of truth to it. And I love how the film evokes that with its spiritualism.
Which is why the film rightfully doesn't necessarily take a side in suggesting that Pietro's way of life and experience isn't necessarily the right or wrong way. We all, need to feel that type of fulfillment in our own ways. But that sense of human connection that you're talking about is ultimately still important. The more we talk about this, I know I made the comparison to Luca, right? Disney Pixar's Luca, and that is certainly apt. We might bring that up a little bit further to talk about the relationship itself. But as we were talking, the movie I started thinking about again that I can compare this to, at least thematically speaking, it's the Banshees of Inisherin, which kind of have like similar, I guess, methods to the ways that people choose to find fulfillment, right? Colin Farrell's character of Colm, was very content with his sense of simplicity and isolation. Wasn't a mountaintop, but it was definitely surrounded by nature and the repetition of that, right? Whereas Brendan Gleeson wanted more of an artful sense of exploration, right? And
Yeah.
then here's Pietro, who's out writing a book in Nepal. So there are some similar, I guess, balancing acts happening here as far as what that fulfillment means. But as we were talking, I started thinking about that. But I, like that movie, I think this film does a really good job not picking a side. It doesn't say that
Yeah.
one person's experience was the right way to go. It's not trying to suggest that we as an audience need to take one of these two characters more to heart as the lesson that we need to learn. It's not that simple, and I do appreciate that.
No, I agree. I think that's an interesting comparison in the sense that you have two characters that are friends that at a certain point just see the world in different ways.
Yeah.
Obviously, Banshees
Very
goes about it.
superficial. Yeah. It's a very different tonal experience. I realize that. I'm really just looking at
Yeah.
the superficial themes and how that balancing act is happening.
Absolutely, because the Ain't Mountains is very much this Malikian experience in the sense
No
that
fingers
it's
get cut off in that one.
No, not at all. But this is about its precision and, again, how these characters keep crossing paths despite them, in a lot of ways, running in the opposite direction. And that does offer up some interesting ideas as far as connection, how we long for connection, how we long for stability, and these places that give us comfort and peace. And for Pietro and Bruno, they start in different places and they end in different places, but they, in a weird way, walk the same path, just in opposite directions.
Yeah.
And I find that interesting. And that's where I think time, is really important to this film, because it does give us, it gives the film a little weight in terms of, the sense of the decades that these characters experience. I mean, we do start, we see them early on when they're just young kids. And I think those opening scenes with young Bruno and Pietro are so good, where we see just how endearing and charming their relationship is, how innocent that relationship is. I think it's really important in demonstrating why these two do have such a deep love for one another. And then as time passes and we see that connection dwindle a little bit, that them connecting in the summers as they do, why that has become, this almost like this spiritual recipe that they invest into their lives. I just think is really fascinating, and how the film melds all that together.
Yeah. Should we talk a little bit further about the relationship at hand and how we felt like it was maybe transitioning into something? Because like we talked about Luca as a comparison, right?
Yeah, I do want to talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And for a little bit of context, when Luca came out was that 2021? I think that was 2020, maybe. It was.
2020.
I think it was
something like
2021, something like that.
Okay.
Needless to say, it's I still think it's top tier Pixar. And something that we loved about that film was how it feels like the film has its cake and it's able to eat it too, as far as its depiction of its central friendship, right? Whether it is strictly platonic or if there was maybe an inkling of something romantic or sexual that it was eventually leading towards, right? And I think that film does a good job sort of maintaining a vagueness as to what that could be. And I do think this film mostly does that as well, pretty successfully. There are times where I felt like, oh, this is about to go full on Brokeback Mountain, isn't it? And maybe that was some of the methodical nature of the way the film was paced, the way that these two people of Pietro and Bruno sort of pondered on each other and just they gracefully look at each other in moments of silence. It felt like the film was almost suggesting like a sexual energy between them. And I'm curious what you thought about that, but I was sometimes getting that vibe, and I'm not saying that as a complaint. It's just a vibe I was kind of picking up on here.
That is interesting. I have somewhat of an opposite take to that, or at least a little bit of a different interpretation. I think that the film is very Luca-esque and
Okay.
how it maintains this ambiguity as it relates to their friendship and what it really is.
Okay.
Now, those early scenes, we see them being, endearing and charming in their playfulness. There's a little bit of a physicality to it, but
It's a little
they're young
friskiness to
enough
it.
that
Yeah.
it's still very innocent. But as they get into their teenage years, you start to wonder what their relationship might be. My issue with the film, or I shouldn't say issue, but where the film starts to deviate from Luca and the
Mhm.
ambiguities of Luca, is that eventually those questions are answered when we see one of the characters, sexually involved with a woman, and then
Mhm.
eventually Bruno is married and has a child with this woman. And at that point, the vagueness of what their relationship is dissipates and becomes much more explicitly platonic. However,
Mhm.
I do think that given the intimacy of those later scenes, you could perhaps still argue that there's a little bit of a vagueness to them. At the very least, I do think that the fondness they have for each other is still palpable.
I agree. Regardless of how you want to define their
Yeah.
friendship or romanticism, whatever it is, whatever way you define that as, there is still a love between them that you
There's
can
still,
feel.
yeah, there's still a love and a care between them. I don't think there's any tension to them once Bruno becomes married. I do
Okay.
feel like, again, the
Okay.
film releases that tension and forgoes ambiguity, unlike Luca. And so, like, again, that's where it starts to deviate. And I wonder if the film should have committed to that ambiguity. Would that have perhaps added to the experience? But
Yeah.
at the same time, I don't necessarily mind where the film goes in that regard for some of the reasons we mentioned earlier and these reversal arcs that they have. I do think there is a role to be played there that adds some poignancy given where the film goes and Bruno's decisions, the choices that he makes, and ultimately
Yeah.
how heartbreaking they are.
Well,
So I do think there is purpose to the relational choices that is made from a script writing perspective.
uh-huh.
But the film does deviate at that point. Either way
Yeah.
though, so like the third act, I don't see the relationship as vague anymore, but it is there. I would definitely
Well,
agree
yeah,
there.
yeah, and as we talk about it further, it's prompting another question that I have, and I haven't listened to enough interviews with the cast and crew for this movie to know if there was any intent with that vagueness. But do you think the movie is going for that, or do you think it really is trying to define the platonic nature of this friendship right from the get go? Uh, I,
I
I,
don't know.
and the reason why I bring that up is because are we projecting our, current social landscape into this movie when we shouldn't be? Are we comparing it to something like Luca just because of the narrative, the Italian setting, the fact that a name like Bruno is mentioned in both of these movies? And Luca
Yeah.
was a film that was very much driven by that ambiguity. That was kind of its DNA,
Yeah.
right?
But I think you can make the same argument about Luca. I don't know if Luca
Yeah,
is explicitly saying that like I feel like that's a movie where we're likely projecting as well. I don't know if it's
perhaps.
asking for us to, necessarily say, hey, this is what these characters might be.
Hmm.
Because I don't think that, like, that film is just about these two friends and how their relationship evolves. But
Hmm.
there is an interesting vagueness to it that can be interpreted because of the social climate,
Yeah.
because of how those characters seemingly respond inside an evolving social climate. But
Hmm.
I don't know if it was intentional. I don't
Well,
know.
and that makes it interesting how our current climates can morph the way we view a movie at a particular time, whether it was
Yeah.
that movie's intent or not.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's the thing. Like as we talk about it further, I don't know if the Eight Mountains is trying to feed off of that, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
From the get-go, this may have just simply started and ended as a story of two friends who just happened to have a surrogate slash literal father shared between them in their lives for different
Yeah.
reasons.
Yep.
Maybe that's all the movie was meant to be. And
Yeah.
so it's just kind of interesting that we talk about it in this way. And I think it's purposeful for us to still talk about it in this way, whether it was the intent of the
Yeah.
film or not, right? Because all art, I think, is
Yeah.
meant to provoke a conversation. Whether it was the right or wrong conversation doesn't matter. That's the
Yeah.
whole point of all of this.
Well, and that's where something like cinematography and performance, I think, are very important,
Mhm.
and why the cinematography to this film isn't just exquisite because of the gorgeous landscapes, but part of that vagueness comes through in how the camera captures these characters interacting with each other. And you see
Mhm.
them look at each other. You see them in the same frame, how they talk and communicate to each other. And then you consider the performances by Marinelli and Borghi, or in the case of even adolescent Pietro and Bruno as well. And those performances, as brief as they are, the camera captures them in such a way that adds to that ambiguity and that
Mhm.
vagueness.
Mhm.
So it might be a little bit of both. It might be
Yeah.
unintentional on the filmmaker's
Maybe. Yeah.
perspective. I do think you're onto something there. It
Maybe.
very much just might be us projecting. This is where the
Well,
culture is.
this is where the
But
culture is because, like I said, there are times, at least in the back half, where we found real moments of tender tranquility between these two characters, where they would more or less just stare at each other and let the quietness just kind of waft over
again,
them. And my thought
exactly.
was, is this slowly becoming a Brokeback Mountain type situation? And again, but that's we're very heavily influenced by the world around us, right? And
Yeah, well,
sometimes
and that's
that's what happens
yeah.
here.
And I felt that more so in the first half of the film,
I did feel a little bit of there too, like it was almost
but
foreshadowing it.
absolutely. And again, it comes down to the camera and how it interacts with these actors. Because, yes, the
Mhm.
way they communicate, the way they look at each other, at times I started to wonder. I started to wonder what their relationship with each other really was.
Mhm.
And then I feel like the film let the air out of the bag when they become sexually involved with these other women. And so then
Mhm.
in the back half of the film, I never felt any of that ambiguity, but I still think there's a tender quality with these characters that
Mhm.
I do appreciate. But it makes me wonder how different the film would have been if they had maintained that same ambiguity. It might have
Well,
been a little bit of a different experience. I still love what's here,
I do too.
but it's still, it just makes me wonder, I
And
guess.
maybe if this movie came out, let's say hypothetically speaking, this exact movie as it's made and nothing were to change, if this came out maybe 15, 20 years ago or something where the current climate was just slightly different, not necessarily in a bad or even like worse or better way, just that what was top of mind for us maybe wasn't as loud or as apparent,
Mhm.
right? Maybe we'd be interpreting this movie even differently. So it just goes
Mhm.
to show how I had no idea that this movie would provoke a conversation about the way art is interpreted at a given time. But
Yeah, I
but
know.
here we are, right? It is a fascinating notion that we can read into it in
Yeah,
this way. That art allows us to do that.
absolutely. And either way, I think the tender quality and sentimentality that's driving that friendship is very important still, because at the heart of the spiritualism that is the nucleus of this film, it's all about how the world around us provokes a lot of the choices that we make, and then ultimately how connection with these people, with our friends, our family, why that is so important.
Hmm.
Even when they come and go in our lives, such as these two characters, there's such a deep, formidable bond that keeps them tethered, that despite the distance, that despite the time, despite the circumstance that might drive a wedge in that at times,
Yeah.
that connection was a part of their identity. And that, I think, comes through because of these performances and how the film captures their interactions throughout the film. So again, regardless of how we might view their relationship to each other,
Right.
and how the characters viewed that, regardless, there is a tender quality that is
Well,
important
yeah.
in evoking those central themes.
That's where the film is able to have its cake and eat it too, if it is going for that, right? Like again, we don't know if it's going for that, but if it is, there is still enough of that bridging to be able to make both sides of that conversation have a place here, which is a hard thing for any film to do, is to find that middle ground. I think this one does.
I agree. I also want to circle back to the cinematography here real quick, because
Sure.
I do love not just the visual beauty, but how it captures the nuance of the mountains. It's almost like this living creature throughout the film. At times, the mountain is this godlike, omniscient presence that's beautiful and grand. But there are also moments where it's daunting and harrowing. It has these changing moods. And depending on the scene, its heights, its valleys, its peaks, they come off as majestical, or it can come off as this place of foreboding tension. And I do love that. I love how the cinematography evokes this third character, if you will, that is always lingering there in the background. And again, that's why I look at the landscape shots are very important in that, because at times, yes, it's beautiful and it's wondrous. And at times, with the mistiness of it all, with the dread kind of lingering there, it does evoke that maybe something horrible is about to happen. But it's
You're
not
right.
just the wide shots. Sometimes it's these close-up shots on the characters, or it's them walking through the mountains and the camera's just following them and capturing a certain mood. And that, to me, is why the cinematography should be considered as the best cinematography of the year. Because you can take a screenshot of a beautiful landscape here, and it's great. And I love it.
The amount of times I've seen movies get nominated for best cinematography just because it's the best location to shoot on the award really should be best scouting,
Location
right?
scouting.
Best location scouting. But you're right. There's a sense of visual storytelling happening here.
Exactly. And that's the difference for me. The shots themselves are often tantalizing, but it's how those shots complement the spiritualism, how it complements the story of these two and these crossing paths, these parallel and crossing paths, but juxtaposing arcs that these two characters are on. I think the cinematography and editing captures that immaculately.
Yes.
And that's the difference.
Yeah.
That's why the cinematography here is just exquisite.
Not sure if we credited the name here yet. Ruben Impens, the cinematographer here credited for this movie. It also works in an almost meteorology kind of way, like when there's a sense of despondency between our two characters, things feel colder, a little snowier, and of course, nature's doing that for us, but there is a slight change of movement from the camera in order to reflect that a little bit more. So from a tonal and emotional standpoint, the cinematography does help emphasize those things too.
Yeah, and not just mood and tone, but the actual story itself. I mean, we talked about earlier about how methodical and ruminative this film is. And the storytelling here relies on these absorbing performances, how understated they are. It's, again, the tender qualities and how they look and communicate. And oftentimes that's non-verbally, or it's these visual images and how they help guide the narrative. For example, I think when this film just simply has been lingering with me for quite some time. And there are a couple of images that come to mind. One of them is Bruno and Pietro as they're building the house. That whole sequence is a nonverbal exchange that I think is just incredibly redolent.
Yeah,
It's so good. And it's the visual storytelling there that makes it powerful. or that final shot of Bruno. We learn everything we need to about him, and the film doesn't tell us anything. There's no narration. There's no text on the screen.
It's all performance based.
It's all in the shot.
Yeah.
It's all in the shot. One simple shot tells us everything we need to know about Bruno and what happened to him.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about, the cinematography. Yes, it evokes tone and mood, but it's also a significant element of
there are times
storytelling.
There are times it could have been a silent film and you get all you need just based on the way it chooses to move, it being the camera and what it chooses to capture, for sure.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
At any rate, any final thoughts on The Eight Mountains?
I want to quickly comment on the soundtrack here. Not the score, but the soundtrack. And I want to try and find it, but I really like the soundtrack. But it's interesting when you watch a movie like this that is primarily in a foreign language. And the soundtrack, I don't know what this means, but I was sort of taken aback how all of the songs here are sung in English.
Yeah, that is interesting. I was wondering about that too.
Yeah, I don't know what it's meant to reflect, if anything. It could just be a simple, choice of song or an artist choice that just fit the overall narrative that the directors felt was best.
I do think it fits the tone of the film well.
It does, yeah. But it was just interesting, kind of jarring, not in a bad way, just jarring to hear that when you're sort of trying to get yourself acclimated to the dialect that you're seeing depicted here.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you're brought back to, like rootsy Americana music. It's just kind of an interesting push and pull there. So I don't know. I just wanted to comment on that. I thought it was a really interesting touch.
Yeah. No, I mean, this film is very spiritual at its core, and it's something that's tapping into time and space in these fascinating ways. And I guess if you really want to get geographical with it,
I guess that
is applicable around the world. I mean, this is centering on one of the 8 mountains, if you will.
Yeah.
But I guess maybe that's suggesting how universal these truths are. Maybe that's getting into. I don't really know, but yeah, the Americana folk music did take me aback a little bit at times, but totally, I think it fits impeccably.
I agree. So. Yeah, it is just an interesting observation that I had.
Okay. Any other final thoughts?
No, it's a good movie. People should check it out.
Yeah, the soundtrack I thought was really good. The score, as I noted earlier, I think is very, very good and complimentary to this film. I do want to echo the performances once again. Luca Marinelli, Alessandro Borghi are very good. I love how internalized and quiet they are. I mean, even when conflict arises between them, there's nothing that's cathartic about it. It's all very, internalized. And those are the kind of performances that I'm very much drawn toward. And I just, I love the precision storytelling here.
Yeah.
And with these two characters, how poetic it all is. And there's something about that approach that works so well with the cinematography and the visual storytelling here, and how grand it is and how harrowing it is. And I do love that, because I do think ultimately, if I had to boil this film down to a simple idea, it's that we all have these moments of self-discovery, and we all have these moments of self-destruction.
Yeah.
We might have them at different parts of our timeline. For me, it might be early. For Brendan, his self-discovery might come later. My destruction might be early on. For you, it might be later. Like it's all varying different timelines. But I think this film is as much about the tearing down as it is the building up. And and to me, I think that's why connection is so important, because we don't know when those things are going to take place, and it's the people around us that help us get through this journey. And I
love you
how
too,
wondrous
JD.
and profound that is. Yeah. All of that to say that I love you all. So But I find that fascinating. I
for
find
sure.
that really fascinating, especially because it centers around this father figure, a literal and surrogate one. I just think is just really fantastic. So I love this movie. It will not be nominated for Best Foreign Language Film, but it probably should. And it should
Hey, we got
also
the
be
In-Session Film
considered-
Awards.
It also should be considered for Best Cinematography because, goddamn, it is incredible.
It's good.
So I very much do recommend this film. At least if you can, manage its methodical pacing and its patience.
Oh, yeah, it won't be for
very
everyone.
patient movie.
Yeah.
But do recommend it if that's something that you think that you will enjoy. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, you can hit us up on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe and like, not just here on YouTube, but if you're listening to the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. I think that's it. Brendan, any final thoughts?
No, I think people should check this one out and go on a journey to the 8 mountains. Find yourself, and then just stay put and relish in nature. The
But
older
not
I
too
get,
long. Not through winter.
Yeah, not too. The older I get, JD, the more I realize I would actually love to be doing that more often. There was a point. I guess it's because I came from such a small town that was basically rural Pennsylvania. I often joke about how it was so easy to be late for high school because we got stuck behind a horse and buggy.
Yeah.
I think because of that, it's I became kind of a city guy for a while, and now the older I get, Maris and I are talking like we would just love to throw everything away and just start a farmette and just let that be like our lives for the rest of it.
There you go. Start milking cows like Bruno does.
Yeah, like in seriousness, maybe grow some grain for local distilleries, maybe some hops for local breweries. Maybe get more in like the sheep and alpaca kind of game or something like that on the organic side of things. I don't know, but long story short, the older I get, the more in tune with nature I get. It's an interesting thing.
All right, there you go. Yeah, I mean, it is something you become more aware of as you get older, I think. There's something about getting older and aging and
the bustle of urban life it's not all it's cracked up to be anymore.
No, and it's easy to get existential about everything.
That's true.
I feel like so.
I don't know. Plus, we like relaxation sometimes.
Yeah, there you go. All right. At any rate, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We will see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Nominate this Film Academy.
It's
you
painterly.
cowards.
Painterly.